He had been flying for a few weeks, and he still couldn't take a sharp turn without losing altitude. Mark corrected for the third time in as many minutes, pulling his trajectory back up after clipping the canopy of a stand of oaks at the edge of the suburban grid, and he told himself this was fine. This was normal. Everyone was bad at things when they were new to them. He had been bad at catching when he was 8, and bad at parallel parking in driver's ed, and now he was bad at maintaining altitude on 90-degree turns, and none of these facts were a referendum on his fundamental worth as a person or a hero. He was following his father through the dark at 1 in the morning, and he was going to see something incredible. That was the story he was telling himself. He had been telling it since he watched Nolan's face change at the kitchen table, the way it went from the face he'd been studying his entire life, open and familiar and his, to something else entirely. Something closed. Something that didn't invite questions. He had watched his father get up from his chair with the quiet, purposeful movement of a man who knew exactly where he was going. And then he had watched him go out the back and into the sky. And he had made a decision that he would later understand was one of the last truly innocent ones he ever made. He was going to see what it actually looked like. His father doing the thing his father did. The city fell behind him. The suburban grid gave way to darker terrain, light industrial zoning, then the broad black expanse of parkland, then the access road that wasn't on any civilian map. Mark had seen the compound from the air exactly once, during a flyover he technically wasn't supposed to have done, but which Cecil Stedman's surveillance records would later confirm he'd done anyway. He knew the shape of it from above, a reinforced structure that presented itself as a private research facility and was not. The sound reached him before the building did. He was 300 feet out, and dropping toward a landing when the sound hit him. A deep, structural impact, the kind that registered in the sternum before the ears caught up. Then, another. Then, something that wasn't quite a human sound, but came from a human throat. He told himself it was a training simulation. He told himself they were testing some new piece of equipment. He told himself this with the specific conviction of someone who knows on some level that they are lying to themselves and are choosing it anyway, because the alternative hasn't fully presented itself yet. He dropped through the skylight. Later, when he was asked to describe what he saw, he would find that language had a structural problem with this moment. Not because it was beyond description, it was entirely describable. But description implied processing, and processing implied sequential intake. And what happened when he came through the skylight was not sequential. It was simultaneous. All of it, at once, in the half-second before his brain's prioritization systems could sort it into anything manageable. The room had been a briefing chamber. It was not that anymore. The long table was in 4 pieces. 2 of them were embedded in opposite walls. The third had become a projectile at some point, and come to rest against the far side of the room in a configuration that suggested enormous lateral force, rather than a fall. The 4th piece was simply gone. He'd learn later it had gone through the exterior wall to the left of the main entrance. The chairs were kindling. The walls were punched through in 3 places, circular impact craters rimmed with crumbling concrete, each one the size of a person. There was blood on the floor. Red Rush was in the corner. Mark's eyes found him. And then his brain intervened and refused to fully process what his eyes were reporting. And this refusal was the kindest thing his brain did for him in the next 48 hours. What he registered was the uniform, unmistakable, the stillness, the angle of things that should not be at that angle. Green Ghost was nearby, her form half visible in the emergency lighting, the translucent quality of her that had always made her difficult to look at directly now making her stillness even more wrong somehow. He did not look at this corner of the room for long. His brain refused those terms as well. 2 uniforms, 2 stillnesses. The information arrived, and was filed in a place he would not open for a long time. Then he found the rest of the room. The immortal was on his knees in the center of the space, and the fact that he was on his knees rather than on his back was a testament to something Mark did not yet have the framework to appreciate. His chest was wrong. The body armor was destroyed, and beneath it the chest itself was wrong in the way that chests are wrong after something has hit them with enough force to compress their architecture. He was breathing. The breath was audible across the room, wet and deliberate and hard-won. War Woman was fighting. She was bleeding from a gash along her temple that had pasted her dark hair to her face in a solid mass, and she was bleeding from her left forearm, and she was fighting anyway. She was in a crouch, both hands raised, tracking and adjusting with the discipline of someone who has been in worse situations and survived them through will rather than odds. Martian Man was pulling himself back to standing along the near wall. His form kept shifting between states, the shape-shifting firing irregularly, stress response instability, the green of his skin visible one moment and then not the next. Black Samson was on one knee, his suit trailing sparks from a point near his left shoulder. His right arm held at an angle that suggested the actuator mechanism had failed. A chorus was slumped against the far side of the room near the equipment rack, one arm pressed to his ribs. His face set with the specific controlled focus of someone managing serious pain and remaining vertical through the management of it. Darkwing was pressed against the wall near the emergency exit, non-powered and visibly terrified, and was pressing himself against the wall not from cowardice, but from the tactical calculation of a non-powered man who had thrown every gadget on his belt at the figure in the center of the room, and achieved nothing with any of them. The figure in the center of the room was his father. Nolan stood with the settled weight of someone who had finished the part of the evening that required effort, and had moved into the part that did not. His white uniform had blood on it that was not his own. His face was the same face Mark had looked at across the breakfast table that morning. The same face that had laughed at something Mark said last Tuesday. The same face that had spent 20 years woven into the ordinary fabric of every morning of Mark's existence. He was raising his fist over the immortal's chest. Mark stood in the skylight rubble. The dust from his entry was still settling around him. He was still wearing the civilian clothes he'd had on when he decided to follow. A gray t-shirt and dark jeans and the blue and white sneakers his mother had been telling him needed replacing for 2 months. He was not in his suit. He was not a hero in this moment. He was a 17-year-old boy, standing in the wreckage of an assumption that had been load-bearing his entire life. 3 seconds. He counted them later, obsessively, trying to understand what he'd been doing in them. He had been doing nothing. He had been standing in the rubble of the skylight, doing nothing, while the immortal bled on the floor below a raised fist. The fist started to come down. "Dad?" His own voice surprised him. It came out cracking at the wrong moment, pitching upward on the second syllable the way his voice did sometimes when he wasn't paying attention to it. It was not a hero's voice. It was not a commanding voice. It was the voice of a boy who still, in some unexamined animal part of himself, believed his father was going to turn around and the face would be wrong and there would be an explanation. Some context that retroactively restructured what he was looking at into something survivable. Every person in the room froze. Nolan's fist stopped. The raised arm held its position without completing the motion, and it was in this suspension, the fist that did not fall, that Mark caught the first indication of something he would spend the rest of his life analyzing. His father turned. Slowly, he turned with the specific quality of a man who was not startled, who had simply encountered a new variable that required assessment. He looked at his son. Mark stood in the rubble in his gray t-shirt and his sneakers that needed replacing, covered in concrete dust from the skylight, looking like what he was, a teenager who had flown across the city in the dark to see something wonderful and had found something else entirely. Nolan looked at him. The fist came down. Not on the immortal. He simply lowered his arm. He looked at his son and lowered his arm, and the room held its breath in a way that had nothing to do with choice. Nolan let the immortal drop. Not carelessly, or rather, carelessly in the specific way of someone who has moved a thing from one category to another, and the new category does not require careful handling. The immortal hit the floor, and the floor registered it, and Nolan was already turning fully toward his son, his attention reassigned with the complete, immediate focus of a man for whom divided attention was a choice rather than a limitation. He looked at the surviving guardians, War Woman still in her fighting crouch, Martian Man half upright against the wall, Darkwing pressed near the exit. And he said, without raising his voice, "If any of you move before I finish, I will complete this faster than you can process the decision." He said it the way you say a fact, not a threat, a description of physics. They believed him. They stayed still. He walked toward Mark. His footsteps crossed the wreckage of the briefing room, through the rubble, around the pieces of the table, past the corner where the two uniforms lay still without his eyes moving toward it, and each step was measured and unhurried. Mark did not move. He would tell himself later it was because he was preparing himself, organizing his response, getting ready to do something. He would eventually stop lying about this and acknowledge that he did not move because his body had reached a processing limit and had simply stopped while it tried to work through the backlog. Nolan stopped 4 feet away. He looked at his son's face with the same careful attention he brought to everything, the assessment, the inventory. Whatever he found there, he filed it and continued. He did not apologize. He explained. His voice was even and unhurried and held the specific warmth of a man who is sharing something important with someone he loves. The tone he used when he talked about history at the breakfast table, about battles and civilizations and the long arcs of things. He talked about the Viltrumite Empire, its age, which was thousands of years, its reach across hundreds of systems, its philosophy that strength was not merely an advantage but the only honest organizing principle the universe had ever produced. He talked about Earth's position in the Empire's expansion, not as a tragedy, he said, but as an inevitability. A planet that would be annexed regardless of whether the process was smooth or costly. And the variable was only which kind it would be. He talked about Mark. He talked about him with genuine tenderness, which was the worst part of the whole conversation. Worse than the arguments, and worse than the bodies in the corner. He told Mark what he was, not human, not the half and half that Mark had understood himself to be, but something better than the half that held him back. He said the human part was a limitation Mark had not yet needed to outgrow, because no situation had demanded it. He said this situation was that demand. He said that the Guardians were not people Mark had a debt to. They were obstacles between Mark and his actual inheritance, the life he was built for. He offered his son a place beside him. He did it gently. He did it with love, the alien, proprietary love of someone who could simultaneously plan the annexation of your world and mean every word of his affection for you, because those two things existed in completely separate compartments in his architecture, and he had never needed to acknowledge the contradiction. Mark had been standing with his arms wrapped around his own torso while his father talked. Not consciously, his arms had migrated there at some point without his instruction, as though his body was attempting to hold itself together from the outside. He was staring at the floor of the room, at the blood on the floor, at the particular shape of the shadow that Red Rush cast in the emergency lighting. When Nolan finished, the room held the silence for several seconds. Then Mark said, "You killed him. Just that." The words came out flat and slightly hoarse, as though he'd been holding his breath without knowing it. Nolan said, "Yes." Mark said, "He had a wife." Something happened in Nolan's face. It was small, a movement in the region of his eyes, something that came and went too quickly to name. Mark caught it. Mark, who had spent 17 years learning to read his father's face the way you learn a language you were raised inside, caught it in the fraction of a second it existed. His father already knew this. The information, that Red Rush had a wife, that someone would hear about this and be destroyed by it, had passed through Nolan's mind before tonight, at some point, and it had made no difference. The calculation had run, and the calculation had produced the same result it produced without that information, and Red Rush had died on a Tuesday night in a room that smelled like broken concrete and blood while his wife was somewhere waiting for him to come home. The conversation was over for Mark. Not because of rage. The rage would come later, in waves, and he would spend weeks not knowing what to do with it. It was over because of something colder and more permanent. A fundamental truth had been confirmed. The man who had handed him a baseball in a backyard was the same man who had done what was done to this room, and those two facts existed simultaneously inside the same person. And no reframing or context or explanation was going to resolve that into something he could live beside. He turned away from his father. He walked toward the Guardians, stepping around the table debris, moving with the automatic, slightly unsteady motion of someone operating on a decision rather than a plan. He knelt beside the immortal. He pressed both hands against the chest wound and felt the wet heat of it against his palms, and did not think about what he was pressing against. He applied pressure. It was the only thing he knew to do. Then he stood. He turned to face his father. His voice did not shake. This surprised him, though not until much later when he had the distance to be surprised by things. It came out level and clear and quiet. "I'm not with you." War Woman moved. She did not speak. She simply repositioned herself from her fighting crouch to standing beside Mark, bleeding from her temple, one hand still raised. It was not a dramatic gesture. It was a statement of arithmetic. She had made her calculation. The immortal, who had taken the kind of damage to his chest that ended conversations permanently for every other category of being, pulled himself upright. The movement was terrible to watch. It cost him something visible. He stood behind Mark with the particular quality of someone who has decided that dying upright is the correct option. Martian Man steadied himself against the wall. Black Samson raised himself to his knees, his ruined suit sparking, his face set. Acorus pushed himself off the equipment rack with his good arm, the other tucked close to his ribs, and crossed the room at a deliberate pace that made clear each step was a choice. He stood with them anyway. Darkwing left the wall. He crossed the room and stood with them. He had no powers. He had run out of gadgets. He stood there anyway. What remained of Earth's premier superhero team assembled beside a 17-year-old boy in a gray t-shirt and blue and white sneakers. Against Omni-Man, against the man who had built this team's home, attended their briefings, worked beside them for years, and then spent this evening methodically dismantling everything that had made that trust feel real. Nolan looked at his son. He looked at the line of damaged, bleeding, battered people who had chosen the side his son was standing on. Something moved behind his eyes. It did not change his face. It moved through the interior of him and then was gone, and his expression settled into something that Mark recognized. He had just never seen it aimed at him before. The door in his father's face closed from the inside. Nolan did not charge. He gave them 30 seconds. He stood in the center of the broken room and looked at the line of people who had chosen to stand against him, and he waited. It was the most terrifying thing he could have done, and Mark understood this even then, even at 17 with a few weeks of flight training and no framework for what was happening, because the waiting said everything about the math. He was not afraid of what they were about to do to him. He was giving them time to understand that. War Woman threw the first punch. She came in with the full weight of her body behind it. A strike that had ended conflicts on 3 continents in the span of her career, and it connected with Nolan's jaw and he moved his head with it, not from the force, but absorbing the vector and rolling with it the way a man rolls with a shove he saw coming. He was already turning as she followed up, and the follow-up caught his shoulder instead of his face, and he caught her punching arm on the third strike, and the exchange was 3 seconds long. Then the immortal came from his right. Martian Man wrapped around him from behind, shifting mass, using body weight rather than strength, trying to pin his arms through sheer volume of contact. Black Samson's suit discharged at full output into the left side of his torso. The sound was enormous in the confined space. Nolan walked forward through it without changing expression. Mark hit him in the face. He used both fists, coming in low and fast from the left where Nolan's attention was occupied by War Woman, and the impact ran up his arms and through his shoulders, and he felt his hands ring with it the way they rang when he'd hit the concrete pillar by accident during his second week of training. His father's face moved approximately 2 inches to the right. Nolan looked at him. Mark hit him again. He did not have a strategy. He did not know enough yet to have a strategy. He was attacking from the angle in front of him because it was the angle in front of him, and this turned out to be tactically useful. Because it was the angle no one with pattern recognition would have chosen, and Nolan's defenses were organized around opponents who knew what they were doing. The 30 seconds that followed were the most coordinated the Guardians had ever been without a briefing. They had fought together for decades. They did not need to talk. War Woman and the Immortal split Nolan's attention across the left-right axis, forcing him to track 2 veteran fighters simultaneously rather than address either one cleanly. Martian Man's grip kept shifting, kept adjusting mass and density, denying Nolan a consistent handle on what was wrapped around him. Black Samson kept firing, not on any hope of penetrating Viltrumite durability, but to force constant repositioning, to deny stable footing, to keep him reactive. A chorus hit from the side in the gaps. Freight train force timed to the moments when 2 of the others had Nolan's arms occupied. Darkwing ran Overwatch from the edges. Every EMP device on his belt deployed in sequence. Every smoke canister. Every piece of disruption equipment in his loadout. None of it affected Nolan directly. He had no technology to disrupt, no visual dependency to exploit with smoke. What the equipment did was affect the room, the variables around Nolan, the sight lines that would allow him to track and predict. It was working the environment rather than the target. It was, under the circumstances, the correct call. Mark was everywhere. This was the thing about him in those 30 seconds that the Immortal would describe later in the debrief. Not his strength. Not his technique, but his location. He was never where Nolan had last registered him. He didn't have the pattern recognition to attack from the correct angles, and so he attacked from all of them, constantly. And his inexperience read as unpredictability because inexperience and unpredictability were producing the same output. Then Nolan adapted. He caught Martian Man mid-repositioning, found the moment between form shifts where the mass cohesion was lowest, and drove him into the floor. The crater Martian Man left was 8 inches deep. Nolan was already moving when Martian Man hit it. War Woman's third combination caught Nolan fully in the face. 3 clean shots. Her hardest. The kind of force that had concussed supernatural beings. Nolan turned his head with the last one and answered it. He caught her punching arm and used her momentum against her, and she went through 2 interior walls in sequence, each one crumbling on contact, before coming to rest against the exterior concrete. The exterior concrete did not crumble. She hit it and stopped, and was still for 4 seconds. 4 seconds was a long time for War Woman. She began moving at second 3. Black Samson's suit took a direct strike to the power housing. The actuator array on the left side failed completely, and the suit locked at the shoulder, the arm dropping to a useless fixed angle. He stepped back, and his good arm brought the remaining capacitors up, and he kept firing with what he had left. Mark took a backhand. Nolan pulled it. He could feel the pulling of it even in the impact, the fraction of the fraction that the blow represented relative to what it could have been, and even pulled. The strike caught the left side of Mark's face and launched him across the room. He hit the far wall. He slid down its face, the exterior, he realized. Because the wall was actually now the outside of the building, and he impacted the ground outside on his back. He lay there for 1 second. His nose was broken. He could feel it broken, the specific wrongness of it, blood running down his upper lip and into his mouth with a copper taste. His vision had gone white at the edges and was returning from the outside in. He got up. He launched back through the hole he'd made on the way out. Inside, Acorus was down. Not dead, conscious but not rising. His arm at the wrong angle and his breathing the shallow breath of someone whose body was making triage decisions. Darkwing was under rubble in the corner near the exit, pinned but alive, his hands still moving through the debris toward a piece of equipment. Black Samson was on both knees, the suit completely dark, the man inside it bare and bleeding and still upright by choice rather than structural support. What remained functional? The Immortal, War Woman, and Mark. The Immortal locked both of Nolan's arms from behind. The grip was extraordinary. Whatever the mechanism of his particular permanence, it extended to his strength. And he had hold of Nolan Grayson with everything he had. War Woman came in from the front. She was in her war form, the full expression of centuries of combat refinement, and she struck his face with concentrated force on every shot. Mark went low, his legs, his knees, his ankles, everything below the waist that the other two left open, over and over and over with everything left in his body. Each hit rang through his arms. He did not stop. For 20 seconds, they actually held him. The Immortal was the anchor. The Immortal was the only reason the 20 seconds happened at all, because he was the one thing in the room that Nolan could not simply remove from the equation by hitting it hard enough. He held, and War Woman worked, and Mark hit the same points repeatedly until the repetition accumulated into something that was less damage than insistence. The 20 seconds ended. Nolan wrenched his right arm free. Not cleanly, it cost him something. A visible effort that Mark would return to many times in the months following, trying to understand what it meant that it cost him something. The arm came free, and he drove the elbow back, and the Immortal took the full force of it across his chest and went into the far wall and did not come back off it. He was alive. He would be alive. For now he was against the wall and finished. Nolan looked at Mark and War Woman across the wreckage. His face held something Mark had no word for. Not fury. Fury he could have categorized, given a home in his mental architecture. This was quieter than fury, and moved through his father's face like weather moving through a landscape, there and visible, and not something the landscape had asked for. It looked like grief. It looked like grief. Which was somehow the worst thing his father's face had done all night. It was Mark and War Woman against Omni-Man. The math of it was not complicated, and both of them understood it. War Woman had been doing this for millennia. Her body's accounting of a fight's remaining capacity was as automatic as breathing, and she had the numbers. They were not good numbers. Her left knee had taken damage in the wall impact that was affecting her movement in the specific way of an injury that has been overridden by will rather than resolved by healing. Every pivot cost her something she did not have unlimited supply of. Mark's vision was still returning to full clarity from the backhand. His nose was a permanent distraction. The blood running into his mouth and down his throat in a thin, constant stream that he kept swallowing without noticing. 3 of his ribs had developed opinions on the matter of breathing that conflicted with his opinions on the matter. He knew they were broken the way you know a thing that your body has been communicating clearly for several minutes and you have been declining to process, because the processing would require stopping. He did not stop. War Woman came in from the left. Mark came in from the right. It was not coordinated in any tactical sense. They did not have time for tactics. Did not have the history together that the full team had not drilled this specific pairing. What they had was the same geometry that the team had been running all night, the principle that had given them 20 seconds of holding, force Nolan to track 2 directions simultaneously, make every moment of engagement with one of them an exposure to the other. Nolan was not staggered by this. He was never staggered. But he was. in the way of a very large and very powerful thing encountering consistent resistance, occupied, he caught Warwoman's right fist and used her forward momentum to redirect her. She went sideways rather than through another wall. A controlled redirect rather than a punishing one, and the control told Mark something important that he filed away. His father was fighting them at a sustained fraction of his capacity, not the fraction from generosity. The fraction from the specific calibration of someone who was managing the situation rather than ending it, who had made a decision at some point in the last several minutes about what outcome he was willing to produce here. Nolan's hand found Mark's collar. The grip closed around the fabric, and the fraction of his father's strength that transferred through that grip was enough, more than enough, an amount that Mark's body registered immediately as an absolute ceiling on the situation. He was lifted. Not violently, not the way the immortal had gone through walls. He was lifted the way you lift something you're trying not to break, held at arm's length, feet leaving the floor, eye level with his father's face. He fought the grip. His hands went to his father's wrist, and he pulled with everything he had, and his everything was not sufficient by a margin that neither of them needed to discuss. He could feel his own strength output against the wrist, and he could feel what it was accomplishing, which was nothing. Nolan looked at him. The room was very quiet. Warwoman had stopped, not because she had stopped fighting, but because she had read the geometry and understood that attacking Nolan's body while Nolan held his son at arm's length created an unacceptable exposure for Mark. She stood with both hands raised and her weight forward, waiting for the configuration to change. Nolan looked at his son's face for a long time. Mark's face was a specific kind of disaster, the broken nose, the blood, the bruising already blooming across his left cheekbone where the backhand had landed. His eyes were clear. Whatever he was feeling was happening somewhere behind them, at a depth that his face was not fully translating. And what his face was translating was a combination of absolute hatred and absolute grief that no 17-year-old should have the vocabulary for. It was the face of someone who is looking directly at a thing they cannot fix and have stopped trying to look away from it. Nolan said, "You have your mother's eyes." He said it quietly. He said it with the specific tenderness of a true thing. He was looking at his son's face and he saw his wife's eyes in it, and it came out of him like a reflex, and the tenderness in it was real, and the tenderness being real while the rest of the evening was also real, was the thing that made Mark's face change in a way that had nothing to do with the physical damage. Nolan set him down. He did not release him gently. He simply opened his hand and let gravity handle the return. And Mark's feet hit the floor, and he found his balance, and he stood there in the wreckage of the room, breathing through his broken nose and looking at his father. Nolan turned to Warwoman. He looked at her with the attention of a general making a final assessment of the field. She looked back at him with the eyes of a warrior who has been in situations where the mathematics were against her before and has reached an age where mathematics are her primary language. "Call off any pursuit," Nolan said. "If a single human vessel follows me into the atmosphere, I will not be measured when I return." He looked at the room one more time. At the immortal against the wall, at the craters and the rubble and the ceiling sections that had come down during the fight. At the corner where two uniforms lay still in the emergency lighting. He did not look at Mark again. He looked at everything else, and then he went up through the ceiling without further ceremony. Not through the hole Mark had made on the way in, but through a new one, his own. The sound of the impact moving upward was enormous, and then it wasn't because he was past the roof and into the open air, and the velocity of his ascent reached the point where conventional hearing couldn't track it. Mark stood in the room and listened to the sound get smaller. He listened to it until it was gone completely. And then he listened to the silence it left behind, which had a specific quality. The silence of a room that has been very loud for a sustained period and is now discovering what quiet sounds like in the aftermath. The emergency lighting hummed. Somewhere in the rubble near the exit, Darkwing was moving, working himself free with the careful, focused effort of someone taking inventory of their own damage as they go. War Woman's hand came to rest on his shoulder. He flinched. Pure reflex, his body's combat response system misfiring, registering contact as threat before his mind could intercept the signal. He caught himself. He steadied. He felt the hand on his shoulder, and he recognized what it was, which was the only form of comfort available in this room right now, and which she was giving him because she was a warrior who had survived enough to know how to be present in the silence after something impossible. She said nothing. There was nothing that arrived in the silence that speech was built to carry. The alarms began at 3 minutes and 40 seconds. Mark had been counting without knowing he was counting. The alarms were Cecil's, the GIDA response signature, the specific frequency and pattern of the early warning network triggering on the combat signatures from the compound. The protocol activating that brought Cecil's vehicles in from 3 staging points simultaneously. Mark looked down at his hands. His father's hands. The same proportions, the same coloring, the same build around the knuckles and the same length in the fingers. He had always noticed the resemblance. He had always been quietly proud of it. The visible proof of the connection, the physical evidence that he came from something exceptional. He had shown his hands to his mother once and said, "Look, they're exactly like Dad's." And she had smiled and said, "Yes, they are," in the voice she used when she was thinking about something she wasn't saying. His hands were covered in blood. Some of it was his, from the nose, from the split skin across his knuckles, where he'd been hitting someone considerably harder than his hands could sustain without cost. Most of it was not his. Most of it had come from the floor when he'd knelt beside the immortal. Some of it from the walls. Some of it from places he did not want to name. He pressed his hands flat against his thighs. He stood up straight. The alarms were getting louder. The vehicles were close. He breathed through his broken nose and looked at the room and let his eyes move to the corner one time. One single deliberate look that he held for 3 seconds and then stopped holding, and then he turned toward the sound of the arriving vehicles and waited for what came next. Cecil Stedman walked through the wreckage of the Guardian's queue with the expression of a man who has been waiting for a specific catastrophe his entire career and has mixed feelings about being right. He moved through the compound entrance and into the briefing room without breaking stride. His DA medical teams were already spreading through the structure behind him, their equipment and their training deploying with the practiced efficiency of people who had done this in worse places with less. His armed containment units came through behind the medics and positioned themselves around the room, and the positioning was deliberate and specific, and Mark watched it happen with the flat attention of someone who has moved past the ability to be surprised by new information. They positioned around him. He noted this. Cecil found a chair that was still structurally sound, one of the few remaining, and carried it to where Mark was sitting on a section of intact floor near the center of the room, and he sat down across from him with the specific quality of a man who has decided that a conversation is going to happen and has organized the furniture accordingly. He looked at Mark for a moment. His eyes moved across the damage to Mark's face, the nose, the cheekbone, the blood that had dried into a pattern on his upper lip and jaw, and then moved around the room, a quick professional inventory, and then came back to Mark. "You saved these people," he said. "I know that. It doesn't change what I need to understand about you," Mark said. "Ask." Cecil asked everything. He asked with the methodical precision of someone who already has a framework and is populating it with verified data rather than building the framework from scratch. What happened, in sequence. What Nolan said, verbatim as possible. What Mark did, and when and why. Who was in what position, and what they were doing when Mark arrived, and what changed after. Mark told him everything. He answered each question in the order it was asked, and he did not editorialize, and he did not spare himself, and he did not ask what any of it was going to mean for him. He had nothing left that was worth protecting. Cecil listened the way he did everything, completely, without the performance of listening, actually taking in each piece and placing it. He asked 3 follow-up questions. Then he sat for a moment with the full picture he'd assembled. He said, "The hand on your throat." He didn't apply pressure. No, he pulled the backhand. "Yes, these are facts about his psychology and not his affection," Cecil said. "I want you to understand that distinction going forward. He could not bring himself to kill his son. That is a tactical exploitable, and it is not the same as love." Mark looked at him. "I know what it is." Cecil studied him for several seconds. Then he nodded once, and stood up and carried the chair back to where he'd found it. The public story broke in stages, the way public stories did when the information was too large to release in a single piece without causing structural damage to the apparatus that was releasing it. The first stage was controlled, an official Gita statement, distributed through appropriate channels, confirming that a significant incident had occurred at a secure facility, that the Guardians of the Globe had been involved, that 2 members of the team had been killed, and that the situation was being managed. No names beyond what was necessary. The language around the perpetrator was careful enough to be useless as information, and precise enough to be technically accurate. The second stage was uncontrolled. It took 48 hours. A satellite feed. A civilian contractor with access to the right monitoring system and the wrong amount of restraint. The footage was not good. High altitude, partial occlusion. The kind of visual evidence that required interpretation. But it was enough. It showed Omni-Man leaving the compound at a trajectory that was not consistent with heroic departure. It showed the subsequent response of 6 JIDA vehicles and a medical convoy. The third stage happened in living rooms and on phone screens, and in office break rooms, and in the specific domestic spaces where people process information that challenges the architecture of what they believed was safe. The fourth stage arrived at Mark's hospital room the following morning in the form of mail. The Gide medical facility where Mark was being treated did not have a public address. The mail came through Gida administrative channels, which meant someone inside the building had either a security problem or a sympathy problem with the sentiment being expressed in the envelopes. The first one was a typed letter that used the phrase alien contamination 3 times. The 7th one, he counted, because counting was a thing he was doing to manage the days. Contained a photograph of his father's face with a handwritten note explaining that the same face would need to be dealt with in time. He read them with the same flat attention he'd applied to everything since the compound. He heard the protest outside his window on day 2. Chants that did not all agree on the specifics of what should happen, but agreed on the general category of what he represented. He stood at the window and watched the signs for several minutes. Then he went back to the bed and stared at the ceiling until the Gita nutritionist brought him lunch. Cecil appeared at his door on the afternoon of day 3. He said, without greeting, 3 senators have formally requested your detention pending a psychological classification procedure. A UN Security Council session is scheduled for Thursday. 2 heads of state have issued statements about biological security classifications. I can tell you which 2 if you're interested, though I suspect you'd find the list depressing. Mark said, "Are you going to let them detain me?" "No," Cecil said. "But the political management of that decision is my problem to handle and not your concern. Your concern at the moment is healing. My ribs are mostly healed." "Your ribs are not mostly healed," Cecil said. "You have 3 fractured ribs, a broken nose that was set under field conditions and will require monitoring, and a moderate concussion that you have been substantially underreporting on the daily assessment forms." He looked at Mark without particular emotion. "I need you functional. That is why I'm invested in your healing. I'm telling you this so we are clear about my position." "That's honest," Mark said. "I find it saves time." On day 4, the Immortal requested to see him. He was in the medical section 3 levels below Mark's room, still immobile from the waist down while the spinal damage completed its resolution. His regeneration was remarkable and not instantaneous, and the damage he'd absorbed during the fight had required it to work through a significant queue. He was propped up in the hospital bed with the specific dignity of someone who has never in their long life been comfortable with being horizontal. His eyes were completely clear. Whatever the healing process cost him, it wasn't costing him that. He looked at Mark for a moment when Mark came in. The look had the quality of assessment, not hostile, not calculating in the way Cecil's assessments were calculating, but the assessment of someone who has been alive long enough to have developed very precise criteria for the things they're looking for. He said, "You stood in front of us. When you had no reason to." Mark did not answer. The immortal said, "There were 3 seconds before you moved. I was watching. Most people who were going to move would have moved in the first second. The 3rd second usually means the person has decided not to move." Mark said, "I almost didn't." "I know," the immortal said. "That's not the part I'm talking about." He looked at the ceiling for a moment and then back at Mark. "I've been alive long enough to understand what that kind of decision costs, and what it means that someone made it." The room was quiet for a bit. Mark said, "He was going to kill you." The immortal said, "He was going to try." The correction was not pride. It was information, the specific factual statement of someone who had tried being killed enough times to know the distinction mattered. Mark almost smiled. The muscles for it engaged and then found insufficient material and stopped. He called his mother from the hospital on day 1. She picked up before the 2nd ring. She said his name. Just his name. 1 syllable. The specific way she said it that he had heard every day of his life. And he said, "Hi, Mom," and neither of them spoke for 11 seconds. He counted. 11 seconds. Then she said, "Come home when you can." That was all. He did not tell her how bad the ribs were. She did not tell him about the news cameras outside the house, or what she'd done when the story broke. They would do both of these things later, over time, in the particular way of people who know they have hard material to work through, and have agreed without discussion to work through it at the pace the other person can manage. He stood at the hospital window on day 5 and watched the protest in the parking lot below. The signs were fewer. 5 days of news cycle had moved the energy somewhere else, the way energy always did, redistributing toward whatever had become more recent. A handful of people remained. One of them had a sign that said "Alien DNA Suck Alien Loyalty" in red block letters. One of them was recording on his phone. One of them was standing quietly with a sign that Mark could not fully read from this angle. He watched them with the steady, flat attention of someone who has processed the relevant information and made a determination. He watched the signs move in the wind. He watched the person with the phone pan across the building's facade and stop on the window where he was standing. He did not step back from the window. He stood there, visible, and waited for what came next. He did not call himself invincible. He had not called himself invincible in months. The name sat in a drawer somewhere in the back of his mind, present, available, carrying the specific weight of something that had been chosen in a different context by a different version of him. He was not ready to retire it permanently. He was not ready to claim it back. Cecil's operational documentation listed him as Asset Grayson, which Mark found honest enough to function inside. He trained 6 hours a day. This was not discipline in the motivational sense. Discipline implied overcoming an impulse not to, and the impulse not to train had not presented itself in 8 months. He trained because the alternative was being what he had been in that room at 1 a.m, in his gray t-shirt and his sneakers, watching his father kill someone and being insufficient to stop it. He trained because insufficiency had a specific and permanent feeling that he preferred not to repeat. Cecil had compiled everything the Gita possessed, and the Gita possessed a remarkable amount. accumulated across decades of the specific paranoid thoroughness of a man who collected information about threats the way other men collected stamps. Every alien encounter on file, centuries of combat intelligence from dozens of planetary contact events, every piece of behavioral data extracted from the Guardian's HQ security footage, frame by frame, annotated by Cecil's analysts and then by Mark himself in the red ink that had become his working medium. He had read all of it. He had made notes in the margins. He had built, over 8 months of accumulated analysis, a tactical library organized around a single specific problem: how to fight someone stronger than you when the someone is also faster than you and more durable than you, and has been doing this for longer than human civilization has existed. The answer was not to be stronger. The answer was not to be faster. The answer was to be more prepared than the opponent's operational model accounted for, and to attack the specific structural points that the opponent's absolute confidence in their own superiority had left unguarded. He had 17 documented structural points now. He added new ones as the footage analysis produced them. He knew his father's combat style the way you know a piece of music you have been playing for 8 months. Not just the notes, but the tendencies. The places where the performer habitually lingers. The moments where the rhythm is predictable because it has never needed to be anything else. He practiced the counter structures until they were automatic. He practiced them until executing them did not require thinking about them, and then he practiced them more until they did not require thinking about them at combat speed. His strength had grown measurably, not exponentially. He was still a fraction of what his father was, still a fraction of what he would eventually be. And he had made his peace with that fact by ceasing to measure against his father's ceiling and beginning to measure against his own progression rate. The progression rate was good. He had been fighting 7 hours of combined sparring and resistance training every week for 8 months. His body was adapting. The process was slow and consistent and cumulative. He did not fight like Omni-Man. He had specifically, deliberately, consciously constructed a fighting style that was the opposite of Omni-Man's in every exploitable dimension. War Woman had begun training him personally on day 12 of his hospital recovery. She had come to his room at 0700, knocked once, and when he opened the door she had told him she would be back at 0800 and he should be dressed for contact work. She had not asked if he wanted to train. She had not framed it as an offer. She trained him 3 sessions per week, 2 hours each, and she gave him no adjustments for age and no concessions for the ongoing rib issue and no mercy in the sense of reduced expectation. She gave him her full attention and her full competence and her genuine assessment of every technique and every error, which was delivered without softening and without cruelty, because War Woman did not traffic in either. She had trained warriors for several thousand years, and she had her own taxonomy for what could be built and what could be improved and what could not be addressed regardless of effort. She told him on week 3 what she had decided he was: coachable. She said it the way she said everything, as information rather than encouragement. He was coachable, which meant the work would translate, which meant the time was worth spending. By month 7 she had stopped correcting most of his execution errors because most of his execution errors had been corrected. She had moved into the phase of training where she was introducing situations rather than techniques, complex multivariable scenarios that required him to apply what he knew to conditions he hadn't seen before. He was operating correctly in 73% of them. She told him this. She told him the target was 85, and they were not there yet. He came back the next session and hit 79. Darkwing's rebuilt equipment loadout was based on a single honest assessment of what had failed against Nolan, which was most of it. He had sat in the Gita debrief and gone through his entire equipment log item by item and identified every technique that had made no measurable impact on the engagement's outcome, and the list was long. His new framework did not attempt to affect a Viltrumite directly. It attempted to affect everything around a Viltrumite, the environment, the information environment, the support infrastructure of any engagement. New EMP frequencies calibrated for the specific electronics profiles of Viltrumite adjacent technology, the ships, the equipment, the communication systems. New atmospheric disruption tools. A tactical overlay system built into his helmet that processed real-time positional data for the whole team and fed it to a heads-up display that let him run battlefield coordination with the specific precision of a conductor who could see the whole orchestra and hear each instrument individually. Black Samson had rebuilt his suit with one engineering goal: sustained force delivery against Viltrumite-class targets. His engineers had presented him with a capacitor array specification, and he had told them to double it. They had told him the power management requirements would make the suit significantly less mobile. He had told them mobility was not the constraint he was optimizing for. The result was a suit that could deliver a sustained energy discharge at a level that, while not sufficient to incapacitate a Viltrumite, was sufficient to force constant repositioning, to deny stable footing, to keep a Viltrumite reactive rather than offensive. It was, as a weapon, not designed to win. It was designed to cost. None of them talked about the night constantly. It was present in every training session and every planning meeting and every piece of equipment design without being explicitly invoked. They had all been in that room, and they were all still here, and the two facts existed in relationship to each other in a way that did not require discussion. Mark found Cecil's contingency file on a Tuesday afternoon during a routine access session. The file was in a location he passed through regularly in his GDA access path, indexed under a classification marker that he would not have found if he had not been looking for it, and which he would not have been looking for if it had not been in a location consistent with deliberate placement. He read the complete file. It was thorough. It covered scenarios in which Viltrumite loyalty emerged under pressure, in which he made choices that endangered Earth's population, in which contact with Nolan produced a behavioral shift that required immediate response. The protocols were specific. The response options were tiered by severity. The file had been built by a professional who took seriously the possibility that the asset he was managing was also, under specific conditions, a threat. He brought the file back to Cecil's office. He set it on the desk between them. Cecil said, "I won't apologize for it." Mark said, "I know. I'm not asking you to." Cecil studied him for several seconds. His face did the thing it did when he was processing something that was adjusting his existing model, a very slight stillness, a quality of internal reorganization. He said, "You're nothing like him." Mark said, "I know that too." They looked at each other across the desk and the file between them. Then Cecil picked up the file and returned it to its place in the system, and the meeting was over. He ran the atmospheric entry trajectory simulations late at night, alone at the Guardian's command console when the building was quiet and the team was resting. He had been refining the models for months, working from the sensor specifications in Cecil's early warning network, cross-referencing against every piece of data the G-Day had on Viltrumite class object deceleration signatures, building and revising and building again. The models were good now. He could see the specific entry corridor, the deceleration curve, the timing window between first detection and atmospheric breach. He had run the scenarios until he understood them the way he understood War Woman's training scenarios, not intellectually, but in the operational part of his mind where decisions happened faster than thought. He knew what was coming. He could see it in the math, the way you see a storm, in the specific way the air changes before the first rain. He leaned back in the chair and looked at the ceiling of the command center and thought about what the numbers meant, and what they required, and how much time the preparation had bought and whether it was enough. Then he sat back up. He opened a new simulation file. He began to build. The alert came at 0312. Mark was already at the console when it sounded. He had been there for 2 hours and 14 minutes, running the final iteration of a simulation he'd been refining for 3 weeks, and when the early warning network fired its first signature flag, he had the immediate, specific feeling of a person who has been building toward a moment and has just arrived at it. The display populated in stages, 4 contact returns, relativistic deceleration curve consistent with the profile he had been modeling, entry trajectory angling toward Earth on an insertion vector that matched no catalog natural object within 3 standard deviations. He had the trajectory analysis running before the alert's second tone finished sounding. Cecil's voice came through the comm 11 seconds later. He had been awake too, which Mark had not verified but had assumed. 4 signatures, Cecil said. Relativistic decel pattern consistent with Viltrumite class. Confirmed, Mark said. 4 objects. Entry window in approximately 6 hours at current deceleration rate. Trajectory suggests a ground insertion in the 40-mile radius we flagged in the month 4 models. A pause. The comm carried the specific quality of Cecil processing information at speed. Analysis, Cecil said. Mark looked at the display for a moment. My read is that it's an advance force. If I had to reconstruct their thinking, Omni-Man goes dark. No signal, no contact, extended silence. You don't commit full Empire resources until you know what happened. You send a small group first. 4. Not an army. Not yet. Enough to determine whether the agent failed, whether the planet is alert, what kind of resistance it can mount. If they're expecting anything at all, they're expecting a traumatized world in recovery. A cleanup problem. Another pause. They're going to be surprised, Mark said. He briefed the team from the command table at 0400. He stood where he had watched his father stand in 100 breakfast table conversations. The same posture, the same forward lean over maps and data, and he did not think about this parallel, because he had made a decision early in the 8 months that some parallels were information and some parallels were noise, and you learn to distinguish between them. He did not give a motivation speech. Cecil had shown him, in their first month of working together, what motivation speeches accomplished in professional military briefing contexts, which was that they told the room the person giving them was uncertain about the room's commitment. He was not uncertain about the room's commitment. He spoke in objectives, positions, primary tactics, and 3 contingency branches for each primary. The immortal was designated anchor. The reasoning was stated without ceremony. His regeneration made him the only team member who could absorb sustained Viltrumite-level punishment and remain functional over an extended engagement window. The immortal nodded once. He had been performing this function his entire career and did not require justification. Black Samson's rebuilt suit was designated primary force occupier, not to damage the Viltrumites directly, but to deny them offensive momentum. The distinction mattered, and Mark explained why. A Viltrumite allowed to operate offensively was a Viltrumite ending the fight. A Viltrumite kept constantly repositioning was a Viltrumite spending its capacity on movement rather than damage delivery. Darkwing's role was overwatch and coordination. His rebuilt tactical overlay system running real-time positional data, directing movement, identifying exposure windows. He would not engage directly. He would be the team's nervous system. Warwoman and Mark would take primary engagement responsibility on the 2 most dangerous targets. Warwoman listened to the full briefing without expression. When Mark finished, she said, "You sound like him." She said it without hostility. She said it as an observation, with the specific neutrality of someone naming a thing they have noticed and believe is relevant to name. Mark did not flinch. He said, "He talked at people. I'm talking with you." She considered this. The distinction was real. He had spent the months noticing the distinction. In himself and in the training sessions and in every briefing he had given, working to ensure it remained real. She considered it for 2 seconds. Then she nodded. The early warning network's 6-hour estimate was accurate to within 14 minutes. The four objects decelerated through atmosphere at 0923 and landed in the open terrain outside the eastern edge of the city. Exactly the insertion point Mark's Month 4 models had predicted, which was itself information about the predictability of Viltrumite tactical doctrine. Mark watched them land from the air, holding position at 500 feet, with the rest of the team staged below and around the prepared engagement zone. 4 Viltrumites, 3 soldiers, and a commander. He identified the commander by positioning before she said anything. She held slightly back from the landing, let the 3 soldiers settle first, assessed the terrain before committing her own position. Leader behavior. He had it in his notes as expected protocol. She looked at the prepared response line below her. The Guardians deployed, the fortified engagement zone, the specific configuration of a team that had been expecting this rather than scrambling to respond to it. She looked at it for a moment with the expression of someone whose expectations have encountered a minor discrepancy and are in the process of updating. Then she looked up and found Mark in the air above her, and the expression became something more specific. He came down. He landed 30 feet from her, far enough for the team to have clear lines, close enough for the conversation to be direct. She was a head taller than him. Her armor was deep crimson and white, worn with the ease of someone for whom it was a second skin. Her eyes moved across him with the efficient inventory of a professional. She said, "Your father was a general. You're a child playing at his desk." Her voice was calibrated. It was the voice of someone who had learned that contempt, delivered precisely, accomplished more than volume. Mark's voice came back level. "He taught me everything I know about your weaknesses. I've had 8 months to study the notes." Something changed in her expression. Not much, a narrowing, a very slight adjustment in the quality of her attention. She had come expecting disorganization. She had come expecting grief and confusion and a traumatized half-breed without a coherent sense of what he was. She was recalibrating. The recalibration took approximately 2 seconds, and then she signaled her 3 soldiers forward. The soldiers came off the landing position at the speed that Viltrumites moved at when they were not particularly concerned about the engagement. Not their maximum. Mark had studied enough Viltrumite combat footage to read the throttle setting, and what they were running was something closer to operational efficiency than genuine urgency. They expected to be done quickly. The Immortal and Warwoman took the largest soldier between them, the same double-pressure geometry that had produced the 20 seconds 8 months ago, refined over 43 repetitions until it ran without communication. The Immortal fixed the left arm. Warwoman worked the right flank. Black Samson's capacitor array discharged at full output into the second soldier's torso the moment he crossed the threshold of the engagement zone. The force was not sufficient to drop a Viltrumite. It was sufficient to send him 3 steps backward and require him to spend the next 4 seconds re-establishing his position. Black Samson discharged again before the 4 seconds elapsed. The third soldier reached Mark. He did not fight this soldier the way he had fought his father. There was no pulling, no involuntary softening, no fraction of capacity held back, because the thing in front of him was someone he had handed a baseball to in a backyard. He fought the soldier with everything he had, completely, on every strike. And when he absorbed punishment, he absorbed it and came back. The soldier hit Mark in the sternum with a strike that lifted him off the ground and sent him skipping across the terrain. He hit the ground twice before arresting the momentum with his flight, came back up, course corrected, and was moving forward again before the slide fully stopped. The soldier was faster than him, stronger than him. Mark knew this and had built the engagement protocol around knowing it. He did not attempt to match the soldier's speed. He got inside it, closed the distance to the range where the large leveraged power strikes became geometrically impossible, where the confined space between them neutralized the soldier's primary advantage. He hit the throat. Viltrumite physiology could absorb the impact. It was not a killing strike, not close. But it forced a half-second disruption, a reflexive gasp, a momentary break in rhythm that was not physical damage but was operational disruption. He hit the inner elbow joint at the angle where the structural leverage collapsed. He hit the back of the knee, the same point, repeatedly, small targets, consistently attacked, relentless and specific and without any particular anger behind them. The soldier was not falling. That was not the goal. The goal was to occupy him completely, while Warwoman and the Immortal finished with theirs. Darkwing's voice came through the tactical overlay. Southwest corner, 2 seconds. Mark shifted his position 2 feet to the left without disengaging, and the soldier's next strike passed through the position he'd vacated and bought him a partial opening on the right side. He used it. The commander had been watching all of this. He felt the moment she stopped watching and started moving, the change in the air of the engagement zone, the specific pressure differential of a Viltrumite at that development level, deciding to step into a situation. He did not look at her yet. He kept his attention on the soldier in front of him, and he felt her approaching in his peripheral awareness, and he let the approach resolve into the space where the team's response was already planned. The commander stopped 10 feet away. She dismissed the third soldier with a gesture, not cruelly, practically, the way you remove an inefficient tool from a task it isn't suited for. She faced Mark directly. She was significantly faster than the soldier, significantly stronger. He could see it in the quality of her stillness, the absolute confidence of something that has never needed to move quickly, because nothing has ever required it to be other than inevitable. He looked at her. She looked at him. Behind her, the team was converging on the remaining soldiers. The battle's next phase was beginning. The plan did not assume anyone on the team could physically match a Viltrumite soldier. This was the first principle Mark had written at the top of the engagement protocol document 8 months ago, in red ink. He had underlined it twice. The plan was designed precisely and completely around the reality that physical matching was not available, and any tactical framework that required it at any point was a framework with a fatal dependency. The Immortal and Warwoman had the largest soldier between them inside the first 4 seconds. The geometry was the same geometry from the room 8 months ago. Left arm, right flank. Sustained pressure from both sides, neither of them trying to overpower him individually, because individual overpowering was not the point. The point was occupation. The point was keeping him fully committed so that his capacity existed in only one place and could not be redirected. The Immortal's grip was the anchor. It had always been the anchor. The soldier drove his elbow back twice, and both times the Immortal took the impact and held. The specific permanence of him, the quality that made him the only person in the engagement zone who could absorb sustained Viltrumite-level punishment and continue to function through the absorption. His arm went wrong on the second elbow strike. A fracture, audible. The bone giving under force that it was not designed to survive. He held the grip. Warwoman worked the exposed flank with the concentrated force of someone who has been doing this for millennia and has refined it past the point of effort into the point of simple execution. She was not trying to incapacitate the soldier. She was trying to cost him, to make every second of this engagement something that required his complete attention and left nothing available for anything else. Black Samson's suit discharged into the second soldier in sustained 3-second bursts, cycling the capacitor array between each burst to maintain output level. The soldier could not stand still under it, not because it was damaging him in any permanent sense, but because it was force, constant and specific and unrelenting, and responding to force required movement. And movement was not offense. The second soldier spent the entire early phase of the engagement repositioning and had not landed a single meaningful strike. Darkwing ran the overlay from concealment, his voice in their earpieces a continuous low stream of positional data. North, 2. Drop, left. Gap at your 9. The information arrived before the situation it described, and let them move into position rather than react to it. The third soldier had reached Mark. He fought him without pulling anything. This was the thing he had decided 8 months ago and had not revisited. He would not fight the way his father fought him, would not apply the fraction of capacity that involuntary restraint produced. He hit the soldier with everything available to him on every strike, and when the soldier hit back he took it, and found the floor, and came back off the floor, and hit again. The soldier was faster. The soldier was stronger. Mark had known this before the engagement began, and had built every element of his approach around knowing it, and not being stopped by knowing it. He got inside the guard. He closed the distance to the range where the large leverage strikes became geometrically awkward, too close for the full arm extension that generated the soldier's peak force. Close enough that the contact was constant, and the soldier's advantages diminished in proportion to the reduced range. He worked the throat, not a killing strike, a disruption, forcing the half-second break in rhythm that the disruption produced. He hit the inner elbow joint at the angle he had identified in the footage analysis. He hit the back of the knee, the same point, the same angle, repeatedly and without variation, because variation would have required thinking, and thinking at this speed cost time he did not have. He went down twice. He came back up twice. On the second time, his vision went gray at the edges from the impact, and he came up anyway and found the soldier's knee before the gray fully cleared. The commander stepped in. She dismissed the third soldier with a gesture and turned to Mark with the specific quality of someone who has been watching a situation and has decided it has gone on long enough. She hit him 3 times before he landed once. His one strike registered on her the way a significant force registers on something built to absorb significant force. Present, acknowledged. Insufficient, she was faster than the soldier, meaningfully faster. She hit him in the ribs with a strike that drove him into the ground hard enough to leave an impression, and he was on his back in a crater of his own making looking up at the afternoon sky, and she was already repositioning above him. The Immortal's arm finished its fracture healing somewhere in the 14 seconds while Mark was down. He released the first soldier. War Woman had him sufficiently occupied, and crossed the engagement zone. His hand closed on the commander's arm from one direction. War Woman hit from the other. Black Samson's suit discharged from the third angle simultaneously, all 3 arriving in the compressed window that Darkwing had called through the overlay, the gap that the positional data had identified 2 seconds before it existed. Mark drove upward from the ground with both fists into her jaw, putting every remaining gram of force in his body behind it. She moved back 4 feet. Her feet left the ground briefly. She did not fall. Her recovery was immediate, the equilibrium of something that had been hit hard before and had built its entire operational baseline around absorbing it. But she moved. 4 feet backward under the force of a 17-year-old half-Viltrumite with 8 months of War Woman's training behind his fists. She looked at him. He looked back. He was a disaster physically. The ribs from the crater impact, a split above his left eye from the first exchange, blood running down his face again in the same pattern it had run the first time 8 months ago in his gray t-shirt. He was breathing through it the way he breathed through everything now, deliberately, as a choice rather than a reflex. She hit him again. He went down again. He came up. She caught him by the throat, her hand around his neck, pressure building, and the pressure was real and specific and building toward the threshold that ended problems permanently. She brought her face close to his. Her voice was completely calm. "Yield," she said. "Cooperate with the transition. Your cooperation has value to the Empire." Mark looked up at her. His face was a specific kind of disaster, and his eyes were completely clear. "Tell them whatever you want," he said. The Immortal's hand closed on her arm. War Woman hit from the second angle. Black Samson's array discharged from the third. She released him. She released him and stepped back, and the 4 of them converged. This was the configuration they had built for. The specific scenario that existed in the engagement protocol under the heading that Mark had written and then crossed out twice before settling on the clinical version, 4-on-1 against a single Viltrumite superior. They had drilled it 22 times. The drill had not felt like this. The drill had felt like a drill. The commander was still not afraid. She had fought 4 opponents before. She had a framework for it, the geometry of managing multiple attack vectors simultaneously, the prioritization system for addressing threats in the order that minimized exposure. She had been operating inside that framework since the Immortal's hand closed on her arm, and the framework was working, and she was not afraid. What she did not have a framework for was the specific quality of the 4 people she was managing. The Immortal held. She broke his grip, the arm went wrong at the elbow with a sound that should have ended the grip's story, and he held anyway. She broke it again at a different point, and the hold changed configuration and remained. She had a framework for opponents who could take damage. She did not have a framework for an opponent for whom damage was simply not a terminus, for whom the concept of being stopped by sufficient physical input did not apply in any conventional sense. Warwoman hit from the second angle with strikes that carried centuries behind them, not the raw force of maximum power output, but the refined force of something that had been sharpened so long that precision had become its primary characteristic. She was targeting the same points on every exchange: left temple, right jaw. The junction between neck and shoulder where the cervical musculature connected to the primary load-bearing structure. Not randomly, not desperately. With the patient, systematic focus of someone who is building an account that will eventually collect. Black Samson's array discharged and forced repositioning, and discharged again before the repositioning completed. She could not establish stable footing. Every time she found a position she could operate from, the discharge moved her out of it, and the movement cost her something, not damage, but rhythm. The specific momentum that made a fighter's combinations effective rather than merely forceful. Mark was everywhere she was not looking. She could not track all 4 simultaneously. This was the protocol's entire point, not to overwhelm her with force, because force was not available in sufficient quantity, but to exceed her tracking capacity so that there was always something arriving from the angle she was not currently managing. She was managing 3 of the 4 correctly at any given moment. The 4th was always Mark, and Mark was always arriving from the angle she was not managing. She drove her elbow into the Immortal's chest, and he lost the grip, and she spun toward Warwoman with a strike that caught her across the left shoulder and sent her down. She turned to address Black Samson's discharge, and Mark hit her in the temple from the right with both fists. She went down to one knee. She came back up. She was fast, but the knee had touched the ground. The Immortal's arm finished some portion of its healing, and the grip returned. Warwoman rose from the shoulder impact and came back. The array discharged from the left. Mark was already moving to the position Darkwing had called through the overlay, a gap that existed for 2 seconds in the geometry of her defense, created by the combination of the Immortal's repositioned grip and the discharge forcing her left side. He hit her throat. Not a killing strike, calibrated, as everything he was doing was calibrated, to the specific threshold of disruption rather than damage. Her rhythm broke. In the half-second of that break, he hit the inner elbow joint at the angle from the footage analysis, and then dropped low and hit the back of her left knee, the same point, 3 times in rapid succession while she was managing the half-second of disruption. She took everything. She answered most of it. The arm he hit went partially wrong and came back. The knee he targeted buckled briefly and recovered. She hit Mark with a backhanded strike that should have ended the exchange, and he hit the ground and came back up, and the coming back up was starting to register on her face in a specific way. She had a framework for stubborn opponents. Stubbornness was pride refusing to accept the physical evidence of inferiority. It was a recognizable quality. She had encountered it before, had fought through it before, knew its texture and its limits and how it eventually ran out. This was not that. She hit him again, and he went down again, and he came up again. and the coming up had nothing in it that resembled stubbornness. It was not defiance. It was not rage or will or the desperate refusal of someone who cannot accept losing. It was something structural, a decision, made somewhere in the previous 8 months and integrated so completely into his operational baseline that it was no longer a decision but a fact about him. He got back up. It was simply what he did. She had no category for this. There was a moment. Mark would return to it afterward in the specific obsessive way he returned to tactical inflection points, where the protocol produced its result. The Immortal had her left arm fully committed. War Woman was driving into her right side with sustained combined force, not single strikes, a sustained pressure that kept her right defensive structure fully occupied. Black Samson's array was discharging continuously at the left angle, cycling faster than the capacitor was designed for, and sustaining the output through what Samson would later describe as personal conviction rather than engineering. 3 directions, fully committed. Her defensive system was operating at maximum capacity across all 3. Mark came from below. He drove both fists upward into her jaw with everything he had in his body, every pound of Viltrumite hybrid force, 8 months of developed and refined and accumulated capacity, every morning of 6-hour training sessions, every session with War Woman, every contingency simulation and footage analysis note written in red ink. All of it translated into a single upward strike at the specific moment when her defensive tracking had nothing left to assign to the 4th direction. Her feet left the ground. She traveled backwards 6 feet and did not fall. The recovery reflex was extraordinary, the result of training and physiology that did not permit falling. But when she landed, she was standing where she had not chosen to stand, and the left arm was held at an angle that was wrong in a way it had not been wrong before. He had broken her left arm at the elbow. He had broken her right wrist on the exchange 3 minutes earlier without registering it consciously, and it registered now in the way she was holding it. War Woman had the consistent work on her temple and jaw, producing accumulated damage that was not spectacular, but was present. She was still standing. She was still functional. She was not finished. But she was on ground she had not expected to occupy, facing a team that had put her there, and the face she was making was the face of someone whose operational model has encountered data it was not built to process. Mark stood in front of her. He was breathing. His left eye was swollen to a partial seal. His ribs were making the same argument they always made after this kind of exchange. His face had the specific damaged quality of someone who has been hit repeatedly by something orders of magnitude stronger than him and has not stopped. He looked at her for several seconds. Then he stepped back. He let her stand. He let her collect herself, or begin to, and he watched her do it without moving toward her. The team held their positions. Nobody pressed. He said, "Go back. Tell the Empire what you found here. Tell them we are not afraid of you. Tell them if they send more, this conversation repeats." He turned away. He let her see him turn away. She stood in the broken terrain of the engagement zone with her broken arm and her damaged wrist, and the accumulated account of an engagement that had gone the direction it had gone. And she was looking at the back of a 17-year-old half-breed who had turned away from her because he had finished the conversation. She did not say anything. She looked at the field around her, at the surviving soldiers. She calculated. Then she went up. The 3 soldiers followed. Mark watched them go, tracked the acceleration until they were past the atmosphere, past the detection range of the early warning network, past everything. War Woman came to stand beside him. The field was quiet, except for Black Samson's suit powering down through its cooling cycle. She said, "You could have killed her." "Yes," he said. "Why didn't you?" He was quiet for a moment. He watched the sky where the 4 of them had been until the sky was just the sky. Killing her tells the Empire how strong we are, he said. Letting her walk away tells them how certain we are. Those are different messages. He looked at the empty sky. Certain is more dangerous. War Woman stood beside him and looked at the same empty sky for a long moment. Then she nodded once. The way she nodded at veteran commanders before major engagements, considered and complete and without qualification. The sun came up on a battlefield that looked like a controlled demolition that had gone considerably further than planned. Cecil's cleanup crews were already moving through it when the light reached the eastern edge of the engagement zone, Gita personnel in their operational gear. Working through the debris with the practiced efficiency of people who had been doing this for 40 years and had developed a specific relationship with wreckage. Medical units were wrapping wounds. Equipment techs were cataloging the damage to Black Samson's suit, which had given more than its designers had planned for and less than Samson had asked of it, and which had done what it needed to do. Nobody died. Not one person on Earth's side of the engagement. Cecil read the casualty report to the assembled team in the JITA Mobile Command Unit, standing with his coffee cup and his flat professional delivery, and the Immortal laughed when he heard the number. The laugh came from somewhere specific, not relief exactly, not celebration, but the particular response of a being who has survived enough impossible things to recognize them on contact and find something in the recognition that arrived as laughter. Cecil waited for it to finish. Then he continued reading. He found Mark sitting on a section of broken outer wall at the field's eastern edge, watching the sunrise. He carried his coffee across the debris field and sat beside him, which was for Cecil an act of deliberate intimacy. He did not sit beside people casually, did not occupy the same physical register as someone without having decided to. He said, "She's carrying a full intelligence assessment back to the Empire. Everything she experienced here, the preparation, the coordination, the engagement outcome will reach their strategic planning division within whatever transit time their ships require." Mark said, "How long does it buy us?" "Years," Cecil said. "The Empire's strategic calculus around Earth has changed. They sent a team expecting a traumatized world in recovery. They received a documented engagement against a prepared defensive force that inflicted meaningful damage on a Viltrumite commander and allowed her to leave under their own terms rather than extracting her under duress." He held his coffee cup with both hands. The distinction matters to Viltrumite psychology. She did not escape. She was released. That communicates something their strategic models are going to spend significant time processing. Mark looked at the horizon. "And when they finish processing it, they will send something we cannot handle the way we handled today," Cecil said. "That is the correct and honest assessment. But years is years, long enough to be significantly stronger. Long enough to have real orbital defenses rather than adapted surveillance equipment. Long enough that when the genuine force projection comes, we are not who we were 8 months ago." Mark said, "Then we use the time." Cecil nodded. He drank his coffee. The field around them was still being catalogued and wrapped and documented. The sun continued its business of rising. The surviving team assembled in the rebuilt command center at 1400. The architecture was different from the original. Everything was different from the original. The walls new. The equipment upgraded through 8 months of Cecil's rebuilding program. The room carrying none of the physical memory of that night except in the people inside it. They looked at each other the way people look at each other after something has been confirmed. Not celebration, none of them were the celebrating kind, and the engagement had cost enough in physical terms that celebration felt like a category error. Something quieter. The specific quality of a group of people who have verified, under conditions that were not controlled, that what they built together does what they built it to do. The Immortal said, "We need to address the team's leadership structure going forward." He was looking at Mark when he said it. Mark said, "I'm 17. "I'm aware of that," the Immortal said. I have also been alive long enough to know what I'm looking at, and I have learned to recognize the things I'm looking for. He held Mark's eyes with the steadiness of someone who does not make casual statements about significant matters. I know what I'm looking at. The room was quiet. Warwoman said, "You don't have to decide today." Mark looked around the room. At the immortal, who had held a grip with a fractured arm because the grip needed holding. At Warwoman, who had given him 3 sessions a week for 8 months and treated him as a peer from the first minute of the first session and had not adjusted that assessment once. At Black Samson, whose suit's capacitor array was currently in 17 pieces because he had pushed it past its engineering tolerances and called it necessary and been right. At Darkwing, who had stood against a wall with no powers and no remaining gadgets 8 months ago and had crossed the room anyway. These people had chosen the side he was standing on, when standing on that side meant facing his father. They had trained with him for 8 months, trusted his tactical judgment when it mattered, gotten back up beside him when they should have stayed down. He said, "I'll think about it." He meant yes. They heard what he meant. He went home in the late afternoon. The house had a silence in it that had been present since the night everything changed and that he had stopped expecting to resolve. It was not an empty silence. His mother was in it, and her presence filled the house with the specific warmth of someone who had made dinner and left the kitchen light on, and asked about his ribs in the voice she had used when he was 8. The silence was the Nolan-shaped absence in the middle of everything, present in the rooms they had shared and loudest in the ones they had used the most. His mother had made too much food. She had always made too much food. She had not adjusted for the absence yet. He did not mention it. She did not mention it. They ate together, and she asked about his ribs, and he said almost healed, and she said good, and she asked if he was sleeping, and he said sometimes, and she said she'd make tea. And the conversation moved through its ordinary domestic channels with the careful attention of 2 people who know there is harder material underneath and have agreed without discussing it to approach it at the pace the other person can manage. After dinner he sat on the back porch and watched the sky while she cleaned up inside. He watched past the clouds, past the atmosphere's visible gradient, into the dark where the stars were, where his father had gone, where the 4 soldiers were going now, carrying their intelligence assessment back to the people who had sent them. He watched the sky the way he had watched it for 8 months, not with fear, not with the sealed door quality of something terrible existing on the other side of it. It felt like a problem with a solution that was actively in progress. The solution was incomplete. It would be incomplete for years, possibly decades, and the incompleteness was not something he had a comfortable relationship with. But it was his to work on, and the working on it had a direction, and the direction was forward. He was not afraid of the sky. He noticed this clearly and filed it. He was at the command console at 11 that night. The building was quiet, the team resting, the field outside cleaned and documented and closed. He opened the document he had been building across the last 4 months, the intelligence assessment. Everything he knew organized into the format Cecil had taught him. Clear headings, verified facts, assessments distinguished from analysis, analysis distinguished from projection. He opened a new section at the end. He wrote for 3 hours. He wrote everything that had happened in the engagement zone that morning, not the tactical record, which Darkwing's overlay system had captured in complete detail. He wrote the qualitative data, what the commander's decision-making revealed about Viltrumite command psychology, what the 3 soldiers' tactical patterns indicated about standard training doctrine, what the moments of the engagement where they had successfully pressured her revealed about the specific vulnerabilities that the protocol had correctly identified. He wrote what he had learned from watching her adapt, from watching what she did when her model encountered data it hadn't anticipated, from watching how she processed the decision to withdraw. He wrote what he would do differently. He wrote what had worked and why it had worked and what the working of it meant for the next version of the protocol. When he finished, he saved it to the secure server and leaned back in the chair and looked at the ceiling of the command center. The building was quiet around him. The city was doing its ordinary work outside. The persistent ambient life of millions of people who had gone through a day that felt like every other day to them, who had no clear knowledge of what had happened at the edge of their city this morning, or what had been prevented, or what was still coming and would need to be prevented again. He was 17 years old. He had broken ribs that were mostly healed. He had not cried about his father yet, and he had stopped trying to predict when he would. And he had stopped deciding whether the not yet was a problem or simply what was true. He had a team that trusted him, and a handler who respected him, and a mother who made too much food, and a planet that was afraid of what he was in the same breath as it needed what he was, and both of those things were real, and neither of them required resolution. He had lost his father. He had lost his idea of his father, which had been built from every morning at the breakfast table and every piece of history explained over dinner, and every time Nolan laughed at something Mark said. All of it had been real. All of it had been architecture for something Mark was never meant to be. He had lost the version of himself that flew across the city in the dark, excited to see his hero. He stood up. He walked to the window. The city was lit and alive and continuing, entirely unaware of what it still had coming, and entirely unaware that there was someone at the window of the Guardians' rebuilt command center who had decided, without announcement or ceremony, that he was going to be here when it came. Not because he was Omni-Man's son. Not because of what his genetics said about what he was supposed to be. Not because of the fear the public felt when they saw him, or the calculations Cecil ran on his contingency value, or the Empire's strategic assessment of his position. Because he was in the room when it mattered. Because he would be in the room when it mattered again. Because that was what a Guardian was, not the name, not the symbol, not the public identity, but the person who showed up, who stood between the thing that was coming and the thing that needed protecting, who got back up. He did not need his father's name for that. He turned from the window. He went back to the console. He opened the simulation files. He got back to work. Let us know what you'd like to see next. The end.